How does Mike Lee represent both a long-standing strain of right-wing Mormon politics, as well as the recent radicalization of American conservatism as part of the MAGA movement? My name is Benjamin Park. I'm a scholar of American religion and politics, and particularly Mormonism, and I've been fascinated with Mike Lee's evolution over the last few years, especially for what he can tell us about the broader story of American politics in general, and Mormon politics in particular. If you haven't noticed, Mike Lee has been in the news a lot in recent weeks. In response to the tragic killings of Minnesota legislator Melissa Hortman and her husband Mark, Lee posted a series of disgusting tweets, one amplifying a debunked and despicable fake news that it was a result of left-wing violence, and another that made light of the murders and calling it the Nightmare on Waltz Street, a reference to the Minnesota governor, Tim Walz. He also pushed recently an immensely unpopular amendment to Trump's Big Beautiful Bill that would have sold off millions of acres of federal lands. National news have been reporting on Mike Lee's radicalization over the years. Just last year, The Atlantic posted Tim Alberta's essay, Why Mike Lee Folded, and just this year, the Salt Lake Tribune published a story on how Mike Lee has been posting on his Based Mike Lee account, more on that later, as often as once every 15 minutes every day since Trump's inauguration. How did he become such a dogmatic partisan? Well, there's both a long-standing Mormon tradition and precedent that he's tapping into, as well as a MAGA radicalization that does not make sense without the broader context. Let's dig in. Many people view Mormonism as a moderate and unoffensive face of moderate, conservative, compassionate politics, personified by former Republican nominee Mitt Romney and characterized by the so-called Utah way of politics that tries to avoid the divisive culture war issues of the broader national stage. But that hasn't always been the case. In fact, dating all the way back to the 1960s, which is when Mormonism took on its politically conservative hue, maybe a topic for another video, there have been at least two strains of Mormon conservative politics, as personified by two of the most prominent Mormon politicians of that decade. On the one side, you had George Romney, Mitt Romney's father, the governor of Michigan, who represented this much more compassionate, moderate conservatism. He rallied for the Republican GOP by supporting civil rights and working with union laborers. The other side, representing the more conspiratorial and partisan edge of conservatism, was Ezra Taft Benson, an LDS apostle who served in Dwight Eisenhower's cabinet and soon became prominent as a John Birch-style conspiratorial politician who denounced the civil rights movement and labor unions, who claimed there was a global cabal trying to undercut liberties and rights, and amplified ideas like other Mormon conservative voices like Cleon, Skousen, and J. Reuben Clark. Both Romney and Benson had presidential aims in 1968. Maybe I'll do a video on the 1968 presidential election in which George Romney tried and failed to get the GOP nomination, and Ezra Taft Benson was nearly the vice presidential candidate on George Wallace's independent ticket. But in the wake of those climactic years, the LDS Church, and especially the powerful politicians within that community, tried to curtail the more extreme edges and muzzled the Ezra Taft Benson type of voices, especially from LDS leadership. And this fringe Mormon conspiratorial extreme politics was pushed mainly to the fringe. Where it remained was picked up by a number of Mormon politicians over the ensuing decades, just waiting to be resurrected on the national stage. By the way, if you enjoyed this type of content, which connects historical background to our modern world, please make sure you are subscribed to this channel. Every Wednesday, I try to do videos that connect history to modern day politics, media, even TV shows and movies to show why history matters. And I do other videos on Mondays and Fridays that try to give some context to these deeply divisive yet eminently important topics. So subscribe to this channel if you haven't yet, and share the videos if you find them useful. Let's get back to the history. Mike Lee is the son of Rex Lee, who was a very prominent Mormon legal thinker and president of BYU, who in many ways personified the Romney style moderate, compassionate conservative. But Mike Lee rose to power on the principle of radicalism as part of the Tea Party revolution that came after Barack Obama's election. This Tea Party movement was based both in white resentment as well as fiscal conservatism. Jill Lepore, in her great book, The Whites of Their Eyes, The Tea Party Revolution, The Battle Over American History, talked about how these Tea Party protesters, of which Mike Lee was one, riding that populist wave, were trying to rewrite history to capture this forgotten radicalism of conservatism. And one of the voices they resurrected was Cleon Skousen, whose book, The 5,000-Year Leap, became a bestseller during those years as a result of the Tea Party movement. Now, again, riding that conservative wave, Mike Lee was elected to the Senate, unseating the incumbent Bob Bennett, who in many ways embodied the middle-of-the-road, compassionate conservative Mormon Utah way of politics. And Mike Lee's election there signaled this transformation of Mormon politics from, again, the Utah way of compassionate conservatism to the much more radical, a throwback to the principles of Ezra, Benson, and Cleon Skousen. And for his first few years in the Senate, he worked with other right-wing figures like Ted Cruz, argued against federal spending, but in many ways was your typical right-wing Tea Party fiscal conservative. He was profiled in McKay Coppins' book, The Wilderness, which was written about the GOP trying to find itself following their 2012 presidential loss, and how he mostly worked behind the scenes. And even though he had radical beliefs, he tried to live up to the dignified calling of a U.S. Senate. But all of that is going to change. Because with Donald Trump's rise to the GOP nomination for the 2016 election, many Republicans had to pivot. But at first they expressed discomfort with the type of politics that the MAGA world of Donald Trump represented, especially in the wake of the Access Hollywood tape, where Donald Trump was caught on tape bragging about sexually assaulting women. Mike Lee was one of many politicians who spoke out saying that Donald Trump should step down for the presidential ticket and get out of politics. But after Trump's victory, and especially after the Republican Party became dependent on the MAGA base, many politicians, including Mike Lee, hitched their wagons to the Trump MAGA train. Mike Lee adopted the type of partisan rhetoric. He, in advance of the 2020 election, called Donald Trump a modern-day Captain Moroni. And during Trump's attempt to overturn the 2020 election, Mike Lee texted him that he was working 14-hour days trying to figure out how to overturn the popularly elected Joe Biden and return that power to Donald Trump. In other words, Mike Lee had been red-pilled into the MAGA conservative movement. But that also meant not just a radicalization of MAGA, but a return to those conspiratorial, anti-democratic politics of someone like Ezra Taft Benson. Side note, Mike Lee is a man who wears many hats, because not only is he a despicable senator, he's also a horrible historian. He's the descendant of John D. Lee, one of the primary instigators at the Mountain Meadows massacre, which I've done a video on in the past. At one point earlier this year, Mike Lee tweeted a quote from John D. Lee right before he was killed, and then defended John D. Lee, calling him a scapegoat and positing a conspiracy that John D. Lee actually tried to stop the massacre, but historians and revisionists have hidden that truth. Just as a reminder, there is a broad historical consensus that is clear from the record that John D. Lee was the abhorrent instigator of that massacre. I could go on and on about the horrible details, but you can go view that previous video. But Mike Lee's defense of his ancestor goes beyond just typical familial pride, but it taps into this broader MAGA resentment of historical scholarship and experts and trying to vindicate the based members of the past, which is truly laughable and disgusting. Now, Mike Lee is far from the only Mormon Republican to latch onto the MAGA movement and evolve in turn. The last decade of Mormon politics is a story of the erosion of the unique moderate Mormon position and the adoption of the broader MAGA politics. Nowhere is this seen more prominently in Utah's Republican Party that has become increasingly radical and to the right, even to the Republican majority in the state. It has become pretty common for the Utah Republican Party to nominate some of the most extreme right-wing MAGA-like figures to positions and then be outvoted in the primary elections. This happened just last year in their governor's election, where the far right-wing Phil Lyman received the party's nomination only to lose to the more moderate Spencer Cox. But even these figures like Spencer Cox, who in many ways are a throwback to the much more moderate and Utah way of politics, have only been able to retain office because they have shifted to the right themselves, often forfeiting the few attempts at moderation that they had previously called for. Remember Cox's Disagree Better initiative that looks quite laughable now with his support for Donald Trump, another major hinge point of a Mormon politician in the last year. Things have become so right-wing and extreme in Utah politics that Mitt Romney, remember the previous GOP presidential nominee who became a Utah senator, no longer had a place in the party. McKay Coppins' wonderful book, Romney, A Reckoning, which charts how Romney fell from the center of the party to the fringe as the party became more MAGA and right-wing, talked about that he did not even feel safe among his constituents anymore, having to spend thousands of dollars on security in the wake of him voting to impeach Donald Trump. Mitt Romney's decline symbolized the decline of this much more compassionate, middle range, and moderate conservatism, and it coincided directly with the rise of Lee's radicalism. I don't think enough can be said about this radicalization of Mike Lee, who always had right-wing views but has now adopted the culture warrior position of the MAGA coalition. He is both driven by and the driver of this radicalization of the Mormon MAGA vote. Nothing symbolized this more than in 2022 when it was revealed that the Twitter account based Mike Lee was Mike Lee's own private account where he was getting off his dank memes and his partisan tweets that were in the style of Elon Musk. Ezra Klein, by the way, once said that if someone takes on a persona in these social media accounts, it is almost inevitable that that persona eventually becomes their personality. And that perhaps explains Mike Lee's radicalization, or at least part of it. Maybe part of it was always inside of him and he was just waiting for this moment to come out. But he's increasingly taken this partisan anti-democratic approach. He attacks his villains. He posits global conspiracies. He verbally represents the craven nature of these MAGA conspiratorial anti-democratic politics. And at the same time, he is tapping into this conspiratorial, extreme, and partisan legacy of people like Ezra Taft Benson and Cleon Skousen. I think it's fair to ask the question at this point, is Mormon moderation, this compassionate, moderate conservatism, dead, or is it just dying? Is this Mormon conservative image that is embodied in Mike Lee going to survive after the Trump era, or is the Romney image going to once again return? Historians make horrible prophets. I'm interested to see what happens, but this seems to be a much more permanent type of shift than we typically thought before the last election. I hope all of this made sense. Let me know what I missed in the comments. Share this video if you found it useful so more people can understand what brought Mike Lee and the Mormon MAGA movement to this moment. And please subscribe to this channel if you haven't yet. History has never been more important than at the present, in part because it gives context to all the craziness that's going on around us.